Hey, my name is Noah Whitfield. I'm 34 years old, and I live on a small piece of land on the edge of the Shenandoah Valley, just outside Waynesboro, Virginia. The property is 11 acres, most of it meadow. The rest an old apple orchard my mother planted in the 1990s that still produces more fruit than I can use, and that I've never been able to bring myself to let go fallow. The house is small and old and drafty in January, in a way that requires most of a Saturday to properly heat. And the porch wraps around two sides, and in summer is the room I use the most. I've been here my whole life. The floors know where I walk. Every corner of the place has a memory in it that I've stopped noticing the way you stopped noticing a sound that has always been there. I keep bees, 12 hives, spread across 3 sites on the property, in spots I chose for sun exposure and wind protection and proximity to the early bloom forage. I sell honey at the farmer's market in Waynesboro on Saturday mornings and to a handful of restaurants and shops in town. And I do contracted grounds maintenance work at 2 nearby vineyards on the days the bees don't need me. It's not a prosperous operation. I was told that before I started, and I've confirmed it every year since. What it gives me is a life that moves at a pace I understand, which I found to be worth more than I would have known to ask for at 25. What bees have taught me, over 10 years of keeping them, is patience in its most structural form. Not the performed kind, not the kind where you set your jaw and endure something you want to hurry. The genuine kind, where you stop wanting to hurry because you've learned that the timing is not yours to set. You can't make a hive produce when it isn't ready. You can't open a box and instruct the colony to get on with it. You create the conditions they need, you stay out of the way, and you wait. The first year I had hives, I made every mistake that impatience makes available to a beekeeper. The third year, I started to hear the difference between a healthy colony and a troubled one before I opened the box. By the 6th year, the box stayed closed, and I still knew. You learn to read living things by staying present with them long enough to understand what you're seeing. There is no faster way to learn it. I wake up at 5:30 most mornings without an alarm. Coffee, then the walk out to check the hives. I do this every day, regardless of weather, not because there's always something wrong, but because being consistently present is the only way you catch the things that need catching before they become things that are past catching. I work the hives in the morning, do the vineyard work 2 afternoons a week, come home, cook something simple and eat it standing at the counter or sitting on the porch depending on the weather, and stay outside until the dark makes the case for going in. On Saturdays, I'm at the market by 7. On Sundays, I read or I don't, and the valley is quiet either way. And I have never found the valley's quiet to be a problem that needed solving. I'm not a person for whom this kind of quiet is a difficulty. My mother raised me here after my father left when I was 12, and she made a whole, considered life out of this property alone for 26 years until she died. And I've tried to honor that. The silence of the place feels inherited, something she left me that I'm still learning how to inhabit properly, which is a different thing from something that's wrong with the house. There was a woman, 7 years ago. Diane, she was from Charlottesville, and she tried the farm life for 2 years with genuine good faith, and at the end of the 2nd year she told me, very kindly, that she felt like a guest who had overstayed, not in the house, but in the life. She said she needed a world larger than 11 acres. I understood this, and I don't falter for it. The doubt I've carried since is quieter than that, not whether she was right to leave, but whether it was the farm she was leaving, or me, or whether at some point those became the same thing. My neighbor to the south is a woman named Ruth Garnett. She's 68, has been on her property for 40 years, and knows more about this land and its weather and its people than anyone I've ever met. She doesn't offer information unless she thinks you need it, which makes what she does offer worth hearing. Her husband Claude died 5 years ago. She didn't change anything about how she lived afterward. Same early mornings, same garden, same coffee on the porch. And I've always found that a form of dignity. The property to my north, a small farmhouse on 3 acres that had been sitting empty for a year and a half, was rented in April of last year by a woman named June Holloway. She was 31. She'd come from Columbus, Ohio, where she'd lived for 6 years, the first 4 with her husband Tom and the last 2 after he died. She told me this the second week she was here, at my kitchen table, in the plain, careful way that people say things when they've learned to say them without the grief flooding back up every time. Not because the grief is gone, but because they've carried it long enough that it no longer surprises them. She was a photographer, freelance, landscapes and natural subjects. She'd come to the valley on a project and decided to stay when it was done. She said, "I stopped being able to think of a reason to go back, and after a while that felt like its own kind of answer." I said, "That sounds right." She said, "Your neighbor Ruth said the same thing to me. She asked me if I had any reason to leave, and I said no, and she said, 'Well then.'" I said, "That sounds like Ruth." I met her the first week she was on the property when she knocked on my gate with a question about a nest under her porch eave. She couldn't tell if they were bees or wasps, she said, and she didn't want to disturb them if they were something I was responsible for. I went and looked. They were yellow jackets. I told her what to use and when to use it. She asked, "Are they aggressive?" I said, "Only if you are first." She thought about this for a moment, and then said, "That seems like a fair system." Over the following months, a loose, unhurried rhythm developed between us. I brought honey when I had a batch that seemed right for it. The late summer wildflower run that tasted like nothing I could name specifically. The buckwheat in September that was dark and strong, and that most people either loved immediately or handed back. She photographed the hives in early June, when the morning light came sideways through the orchard and made the boxes look like something out of a century before ours, and she asked such specific questions about the frame structure and the comb pattern that the conversation lasted 2 hours, and we ended up sitting in the grass at the edge of the apiary eating her lunch, because neither of us had. Thought to stop when we should have. She said, "Does it bother you when people treat them like they're dangerous?" I said, "It bothers me when people treat them like they're not." She said, "That's a distinction." I said, "Most worthwhile things are distinctions." She fixed the fence on her east property line one Saturday in late July without asking for help, which I noticed because it was a 2-person job done 1 person at a time with more patience than efficiency. I watched from a distance and didn't offer. When she was done, she looked satisfied in the specific way of someone who decided something was going to be done alone and did it alone. That evening, I left a jar of the buckwheat on her porch with a note that said, "For the fence." She left the empty jar back on my porch 2 days later with a photograph tucked inside it. The hives in the orchard light printed small, and on the back she'd written, "For the honey." I put it on the windowsill in the workshop where I could see it. We ate dinner on my porch on a Wednesday evening in August and talked for 3 hours about the kind of things you talk about when you're still figuring out who someone is, what they grew up around and what they left and what they chose and why. She told me about Tom. Not everything, but enough. She said he died on a Tuesday. Cardiac event. He was 34 years old and had run a half marathon 2 weeks before. She said, "The impossible thing about sudden loss is that you never get to have the conversation you would have had if you'd known. Every conversation you had with someone became the last one without your permission." which means you spend a long time going back through them, trying to decide if they were enough. She said, "I've decided they were." It took 2 years. She said it looking at the valley, not at me, and I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that wasn't smaller than what she'd just said, so I just stayed in it with her, and she seemed to know that was what I was doing. I liked her over those months in the clear and simple way first, and then in the less simple way that had been accumulating without announcement, and I was careful about it. Not because of anything she'd said or done, because she was still somewhere between the life she'd had and whatever came next, and I was not going to add weight to that before she'd found her feet in the new thing. There was a Saturday in late August when I saw her at the farmer's market. She was at the table next to mine, it turned out, buying vegetables from the Hendersons, who had been farming 3 properties east of mine since before I was born. She looked at my honey display with the same attention she gave everything, and then she picked up the buckwheat jar and said, "I didn't know honey came in this color." I said, "Most people don't." She said, "Will I like it?" I said, "Probably not at first." She bought it anyway. She came back the following Saturday and said, "You were wrong." I said, "I'm glad." She said, "It tastes like everything it didn't tell you it was going to taste like." I said, "That's the most accurate description of buckwheat honey I've ever heard." She took another jar. I showed her the observation windows I'd built into 2 of the strongest hives in September. Small glass panels set into the side of the boxes, so you could see the comb and the movement inside without disturbing anything. She pressed her face close to the glass and didn't say anything for a long time. When she stood up, she said, "They don't know we're here." I said, "They know something is here. They just don't know what to make of it, so they keep working." She said that's a useful response to have to things you don't understand. I looked at her for a moment. She was looking at the hive, not at me. I said, "Yes, it is." She had a dry, specific humor that caught you sideways. One evening I came in from the apiary with a sting on my forearm, second one in a week, which meant I'd been distracted and gotten sloppy, and she was on my porch and she looked at it and said, "I thought you were the expert." I said, "Being the expert doesn't make you immune." She said, "That's the most relatable thing anyone has said to me in months." She went back to her book. I sat down and we stayed on the porch until it was too dark to see anything. And that was a whole evening, and neither of us needed it to be more than that. Ruth came by in September, supposedly to return a hive tool she'd borrowed in spring and found cleaning out her garage. She set it on the bench and said, without any particular transition, "The woman to your north." I said, "Yes." She said, "She's been through something that would have finished most people. She didn't let it finish her. Do you understand what that takes?" I said, "I think so." Ruth said, "I don't think you entirely do. But you're paying attention, which is the start of it." She went home. October 14th was a Tuesday. I knew the date without anyone telling me. Not because June had said anything specific. She'd gotten quieter since the start of October. A particular kind of quiet with a date attached to it that I recognized from the years after my mother died, from the way the weeks before the anniversary always felt slightly harder to move through than the weeks after. I'd been giving her a little more space in October. I'd thought that was what she needed. I was asleep when she knocked. A few minutes past midnight. 3 knocks. Not urgent. Just deliberate. I was up into the door before I'd finished waking. She was standing on my porch in a flannel shirt and her barn boots, hair loose, arms crossed in front of her chest. Not cold. Just the position of someone keeping track of their own edges. Her face had the specific look of a person who has been crying for a long time and has stopped, not because the feeling was done, but because the body ran out of what it needed to keep going. She'd walked the 300 feet between our properties in the dark and the cold without a coat, which told me how long she'd been sitting with the decision before she made it. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I need you to hold me. Just for tonight." She said it quietly, the way you say something you've been arguing with yourself about for hours, and have finally said out loud and can't unsay, the specific sound of relief and exposure at the same time, watching for what saying it costs. I almost said something useful. I almost said, "Do you want to come in? Do you want some tea? Do you want to talk?" All the things you say when you want to help and don't know how to be simple about it. But she hadn't asked for any of those things. She'd said exactly what she meant, with more precision and more courage than most people manage at midnight, and what she meant was exactly what she'd said. I said, "Okay." I sat down on the porch steps, and she sat beside me, and I put my arm around her, and she turned into my shoulder, and we stayed there. The valley was dark, and the stars were thick overhead, and the temperature had dropped enough that I could see my breath. She was shaking slightly, and then not shaking. After a while, her breathing changed, and she went still against my side, and I sat with the weight of her in the cold of the night, and didn't move, and didn't say anything, and didn't need to. We stayed until about 2 in the morning when she said, "I should go back." I walked her home 300 feet, 90 seconds, and I waited on her porch until I saw the light come on inside. Then I walked back to my own house and sat in the kitchen for an hour, not particularly thinking about anything, just sitting with the weight of a night that had asked something specific of me and gotten it. She came over the next afternoon. She'd made bread, a thing she'd never brought before, and she set it on the table and sat down and said, "I should tell you what last night was." I said, "You don't owe me an explanation." She said, "I know. I want to give you one anyway." She said, "It was the anniversary. 2 years to the day. I'd managed the first one because I was in Columbus, and there were people and ceremonies, and the shape of the day was held up by other things. Here there was just the day and me in that house, and somewhere around midnight the shape fell apart and I couldn't find it again. And I saw your light. I said, "I'm glad you knocked." She said, "I put the 'just for tonight' part in because I didn't want you to feel obligated. I didn't want it to be something you felt like you had to keep doing." I said, "I didn't feel obligated." She said, "No?" I said, "I wanted to be there. Those are different." She looked at the bread on the table between us for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." She stayed for dinner. We didn't go back to the night directly. We talked about her project, about the light in the valley in October, about whether the hive nearest the orchard was going to need supplemental feeding before winter. She'd been reading about winter preparation, she said, the cluster, how the bees kept each other warm. I told her about the winter cluster, about how the bees pressed together in cold weather into a dense ball around the center of the hive, the queen at the core, and how they cycle continuously from the cold outer edge to the warm center and back, each bee spending time in the cold so that others can warm before they trade places. No one bee stays warm at the expense of others. No one bee faces the cold alone indefinitely. They survive the winter by taking turns keeping each other from dying in it. She listened the way she listened when something was going in deep, her chin on one hand, not moving. When I was done, she said, "That's the most quietly beautiful thing I've heard in a long time." I said, "They've been doing it for 20 million years." She said, "I know. That's why." Over the weeks that followed, something shifted in the quality of the time we spent together. Not more dramatic, just more honest, like a window that had been slightly clouded and had cleared. She started coming to the apiary in the mornings, first to photograph and then just because she'd started finding it interesting, and I showed her how to work a frame, how to read the comb, when to intervene, and when the right thing was to leave the hive alone. She was good at it from the start, not technically, that takes time, but temperamentally. She had what beekeeping requires before everything else. She was calm in the presence of a thing that could alarm her. She could stand with bees moving across her hands and stay still, not because she felt nothing, but because she understood that the flinch was the one thing that would turn the situation into a problem. In November, she photographed the covered hives from outside in the early morning cold, the valley behind them gray and still. She said she wanted to do a series on waiting, on what living things look like when they're in their dormant state, when the activity has gone internal and invisible. I said, "That's a difficult quality to photograph." She said, "I know. That's what I'm trying to figure out." In December, she started bringing her camera to the morning hive checks, not always shooting, sometimes just there. She said, "I want to understand the rhythm before I try to photograph it." I said, "That's a better instinct than most photographers have." She said, "I've had bad instincts before. I've learned." One evening in December, after the hives were settled for winter and the work had gone quiet, she asked me about the farm after Diane left. She said it carefully, not intrusively, she said. "You don't have to," I said. "I know." So I told her. I told her about the 2 years I spent after Diane left being extremely busy, which was the way I'd learned to deal with things I didn't know what to do with, and about how I eventually realized I'd organized my whole life around being too useful to be lonely, making myself indispensable to the vineyards, to the market, to the hives, filling the hours so completely that there was nowhere for the absence to sit down. She listened with her hands around her tea mug. When I was done, she said, "I know that method." I said, "Yes, I thought you might." She said, "Does it work?" I said, "It gets you through. It doesn't get you to anything." She said, "No, it doesn't." She looked out the kitchen window at the dark meadow for a moment, and then back at me. She said, "I spent the first year after Tom using the same method. And then I moved here, and the valley slowed me down. There isn't enough to fill the hours the same way." She said, "I've had to learn to sit with things instead of moving past them. It's slower, but it's more honest." I said, "Yes." She put her hand on the table beside mine, not on it, just beside it, close. We sat there until the tea was cold. Ruth came by the workshop in late November with her hive tool, which she'd found again and then lost again and found once more in the mudroom. She put it on the bench and looked at me for a moment. She said, "You're doing the right thing with her, going slow." I said, "I'm not sure I'm doing anything with her." Ruth said, "I know you believe that." She picked up her tool and went home. Emma Holloway arrived in the first week of February. She was Tom's older sister, 38, a teacher from Columbus, and she'd driven 4 hours on a Friday to check on June, which was genuinely how it started. But when she got here and saw the photographs on the walls and the bread cooling on the counter and the way June moved through the farmhouse like someone who had planted herself rather than parked temporarily, something changed in Emma's face that I recognized from a distance as a particular kind of grief. The grief of someone who has been keeping a person's memory alive as something fixed and is, watching it, slowly, become something carried instead. I met her briefly the afternoon she arrived. She was composed, kind, said the appropriate things. I said the appropriate things. June walked me out to my truck and said, "She's having a hard time with it." I said, I know. I'm right here. She nodded. On the second day, I came home from the vineyard in late afternoon to find June's kitchen window lit and two voices going, one steady, one not. I stood on my porch for a moment, and then I went inside my house because what was happening in that kitchen belonged to them. June came over that evening. She sat at my table, and she was calm in the way of someone who has done something difficult and come through it. She said, Emma thinks I'm letting go of Tom. I said, are you? She said, I'm learning to hold him differently. He's not going anywhere. He's just, she paused. She said, he's in the photographs on the wall, and in the way I learned to make his mother's bread, and in the fact that I know. Because of him, what it feels like to be chosen by someone you didn't expect. He's in all of that. He doesn't have to be in the reason I keep the blinds down. She said, I told her that Tom knew me, that he would not have wanted this. She said, the man I married spent our whole marriage telling me to go further into things that frightened me, not to stay back from them. And the most frightening thing I've done in 2 years is let myself want something again. She looked at me when she said the last part. She said, I told her I wasn't sorry about it. The room was quiet. Outside, the valley was dark and cold, and the hives were clustered and warm. I said, what did she say? She said, she cried. And then she said she was glad I was somewhere that had good light. She meant the photography. But I think she might have meant more than that. She looked at the table for a moment, and then back up at me. She said, I've been wanting to tell you something. I said, then tell me. She said, the just for tonight part. I said it to protect you, so you wouldn't feel like you were taking on something permanent. I was trying to give you an out. I said, I didn't want an out. She said, I know that now. I didn't know it then. She said, I've been thinking about you, Noah, for longer than I've let myself say. I kept it in a place I wasn't sure I was allowed to go to, and then October happened and I went there anyway, and now I can't pretend I didn't. I said, I've been doing the same thing. She said, then why didn't you? I said, because I was afraid of being the thing you regretted. You'd been through the worst thing, and you were rebuilding, and I wasn't going to put my own wanting in the middle of that and call it care. She said, that sounds like care. I said, it started as care. After a while it was care and fear in roughly equal amounts, and I stopped being sure which one was steering. She said, what were you afraid of, specifically? I said, that you'd decide 11 acres in the Shenandoah Valley was beautiful for a year, and then start to feel like Diane did. Like a guest. She looked at me with an expression I'd seen on her before. The expression she had when she was deciding whether to say the whole true thing or the careful version of it. She said the whole true thing. She said, I've been here 10 months. I stayed past the project. I learned your bees. I fixed my fence and put down a garden, and I have not once looked at the road out of here and felt what you're describing. And I understand that fear is not something you reason out of. I know that better than most. But I need you to know that I'm not here by accident, and I'm not here temporarily, and I didn't walk 300 feet in the cold in the middle of the night to ask for something from someone I was planning to leave. She said, the just for tonight was me protecting you. It wasn't me telling you the truth about what I wanted. She said, what I wanted was all the nights. The room was quiet. I sat with what she'd just said in the way I'd learned to sit with things in the apiary, not moving toward it before I'd heard all of it, not responding before I understood what I was responding to. I had been afraid she would leave, because I had watched everything I loved either leave this land or lose itself in it. My father left. My mother died into it. Diane found it beautiful, and then found it impossible. I had built a life that required nothing to stay, and had told myself that was wisdom. It wasn't wisdom. It was a hive with the observation window boarded over, a colony you never checked because you were afraid of what you'd find. She was looking at me. I said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." I said, "Yes." She looked at me for another moment, and then something in her expression settled. The particular settling of someone who has been holding a shape for a long time and has finally been given permission to put it down. I crossed the room. I put my hand against the side of her face, just that, my palm against her jaw, and she leaned into it the way she had on the porch in October. That same quality of finding the right weight distribution, and I thought about the bees in their winter cluster pressing toward the warm center, giving their heat away and taking it back in the same motion. I thought about how there is no other mechanism. You don't survive the cold by staying separate from the thing you're trying to keep warm. I kissed her, not carefully. She said, against my shoulder, "Just for tonight was never what I actually wanted." I said, "I know." She said, "I want more than tonight." I said, "So do I. I've wanted more than tonight since August." She pulled back and looked at me. She said, "August?" I said, "The conversation on the porch. About Tom. You looked at the valley and said you decided the conversations were enough. I thought about that for 3 months." She said, "You are the most patient man I've ever met." I said, "Occupational requirement." She laughed. It filled the kitchen in a way that felt like the room had been waiting for that specific sound. The following spring, the apiary had its best production in 4 years. I'd made 2 splits in February from the strongest colonies, and both had taken. And the early bloom came in heavy, and the bees came out of winter, with their stores intact and their populations healthy. June's winter series, the covered hives, the frost on the observation window, the bare orchard waiting, the valley under snow, was accepted by a gallery in Richmond for a show in May. Ruth came to the opening and stood in front of the photograph of the winter cluster for a long time, the bees just visible through the glass, dense and still, keeping their center warm. She said she understood what she was looking at. I said, "Yes." Ruth said, "Good." She moved on to the next photograph. Emma came back in late March. She and June spent 2 days together at June's farmhouse. I wasn't part of those conversations, and didn't try to be. When Emma left, she came to find me in the apiary. She stood at the edge of the hive yard for a moment, watching me work, and then she said, "She's okay." I said, "She is." Emma said, "Tom would have liked this. The bees, the valley." She paused. She said, "You." She got in her car and drove back to Columbus, and I stood in the hive yard with that for a long while and let it mean what it meant. June moved the last of her things to my house in April. There wasn't much left at the farmhouse by then. She'd been spending most nights with me since February, and the final move was a formality more than an event. She brought her camera equipment, and her reference books, and a collection of seeds she'd been saving for a kitchen garden she'd been planning since fall, and she put them in the pantry in the small drawer she'd already claimed for such things. The last thing she carried in was a photograph in a frame. Tom and her at the coast, a summer afternoon. He was laughing at something out of frame, and she was looking at him with the specific expression of someone watching the best version of something she loves. She set it on the shelf in the hallway, at the end, where you could see it from the kitchen table. She said, "Is this okay?" I said, "He's part of what made you. He stays." She put her hand over mine on the counter and didn't say anything, and neither did I, and the valley was green through the window, and the hives were working, and that was enough. By summer, she had the kitchen garden in, a long narrow bed along the east wall where the morning light landed first, and she grew things I didn't know what to do with, and taught me what to do with them. The way you teach someone things you know when they're willing to learn. The market table doubled, honey on one side, whatever was coming in from the garden on the other, her photographs pinned to a board above, small ones, unframed, priced for what they cost to print. She sold out every Saturday and came home with the same expression I had after a good harvest. Quiet. Satisfied. The particular feeling of having given something you grew to someone who wanted it. Ruth came for dinner in July and sat at the table I'd had for 15 years in the kitchen that had always felt provisional and now didn't, and she ate everything on her plate and said, "Well." She looked around the room, the photographs on the walls, the seeds drying on the windowsill. 2 pairs of boots by the back door instead of 1. She said, "Well." She went home. That was the whole review, and it was enough. I still think about October. About the weight of that night, the cold porch and the dark valley, and her shoulder pressed against mine. About what it costs a person to walk across a field at midnight and say, "I need you." About the just for tonight and what it contained. All the fear that the asking was too much. All the hope that it wasn't. The hedge she'd built around the ask to make it small enough to survive being said out loud. Bees survive winter because they press together. They give their heat to the cluster, and they take heat from the cluster in the same motion. And no single bee has to face the cold alone, and the hive survives because not one of them tries to. 20 million years of getting it right. The mechanism is not complicated. You move toward the thing you're trying to keep warm. You take your turn in the cold. You don't let distance be the thing that costs you. She woke me up at midnight and asked for just one night. She didn't know she was asking for all the ones after. I didn't know I had been waiting for the asking. We found that out together, which is the only honest way to find anything out, and by spring the bees were working, and the valley was green, and the house held 2 people's footsteps, and the just for tonight had become all the rest of them. And that was more than I had known how to want and exactly what I should have.